I want you to picture a physical impossibility right now. Just try to visualize fried ice.
Fried ice.
Right. So hold that image in your mind for a second. Taking a block of frozen water, hard and cold, and tossing it into a vat of boiling oil. It is a complete contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron. I mean, the physics just doesn't allow it.
It's a category error. The two states simply cannot coexist.
Exactly. And that is exactly where we have to start today for this deep dive. Because according to Gordon Fee, one of the heavy hitter commentators we're using today, that is precisely how the phrase Christ crucified sounded to a first century ear. It was fried ice.
It's such a potent image to start with, and Fee is absolutely correct here. To the ancient mind, those two words, Christos, the Messiah, and Staros, the cross, they simply could not go together. They were antonyms.
Right, because Messiah meant?
It meant power, splendor. The conquering king who kicks out the occupiers and establishes this eternal reign. It was the ultimate victory.
And crucifixion?
Crucifixion was the ultimate defeat. It wasn't just a method of execution. It was a state-sponsored terror tactic reserved for slaves, for rebels, the absolute scum of the earth. It was designed to do a lot more than just kill you. It was designed to unperson you, to completely strip away your honor before taking your life. So to say Messiah crucified wasn't just confusing. It was highly offensive. It was madness.
It was a scandal. And that really brings us to the central mystery of the document we are analyzing today, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. How did a message that was considered madness to the Greeks and a scandal to the Jews become the foundation of the faith? And more specifically, why were the people in Corinth the very people who had actually accepted this message trying to upgrade it?
Right, trying to polish the fried ice to make it look like wisdom.
Exactly. Why take the most subversive message in human history and try to make it respectable?
That is the core question.
So let's set the table. We were doing a deep dive into 1 Corinthians chapter 1 today. And we have a stack of 3 incredible commentaries to guide us. This is effectively the dream team of Corinthian scholarship. We've got David Garland from the BECNT series, Gordon Fee from the NICNT, and Anthony Thiselton from the NIGTC.
A sociologist, a pneumatological theologian, and a philosopher.
That's the lineup. And our mission is to understand how Paul tries to course correct a church that has essentially lost its mind by trying to be too smart. But before we get into the text itself, we need to understand where we are. Because when most of you hear the word Corinth, you probably think of white columns, togas, maybe a generic Greek city like Athens where people sit around debating philosophy all day.
And David Garland points out that is completely the wrong image for this specific time period. If you're picturing Athens, you're missing the text. You have to picture a Roman colony.
Garland hits this so hard. He says Corinth was a miniature Rome.
Yeah, it had been destroyed and then refounded by Julius Caesar. So it was the capital of the province of Achaia. It wasn't some sleepy university town. It was a boom town. It was, think of New York in the 80s mixed with ancient Rome. It was a colony established specifically to foster Roman culture and Roman values.
And what were those values exactly?
Status, hierarchy,
yeah,
honor, and what Garland calls the big man leadership style. It was a culture entirely obsessed with who you knew, who your patron was, and how much social clout you had. It was a place where freed slaves could actually become rich, so there was this intense status anxiety. Everyone was just frantically climbing the ladder.
And Garland points out something really interesting about the church there, specifically when you compare it to the church in Thessalonica. Because in 1 Thessalonians, the church is being hammered. They're actively persecuted. But here in Corinth,
Garland notes, there is virtually no evidence of persecution or social alienation in 1 Corinthians. The Christians there were comfortable. They were integrating really well. I mean, they were suing each other in civil courts. They were attending pagan feasts. They weren't suffering for their faith at all. They were actually trying to make their faith fit into their social climbing.
So the problem wasn't external pressure. It was internal rot.
Precisely. They were adopting the values of that Roman culture, the status, the rhetorical skill, the quote-unquote wisdom, and trying to paste them right onto the gospel. Fee calls this triumphalism.
Define that for us.
It's a theology of glory without the cross. Fee argues that they had this over-realized eschatology.
Meaning they thought they had already arrived.
Exactly. They thought they had arrived spiritually. They believed they were already living in the full power of the kingdom, ruling like kings, filled with the Spirit, speaking in the tongues of angels. They wanted all the resurrection power without any of the humiliation of the cross.
Which brings us nicely to our guides for this deep dive. I want to briefly introduce their theological DNA so you, the listener, know the lens we're looking through when we mention them. Let's start with David E. Garland. I call him the sociologist.
That fits perfectly. Garland's commentary is intensely focused on the social background. He explains the conflict not necessarily as a theological war, but as personality-centered politics.
Right.
He thinks the church was just mimicking the secular rivalries of the city, like students fighting over which sophist or which philosopher was the absolute best. For Garland, the root issue is social stratification.
Then we have Gordon D. Fee. I see him as the pneumatological theologian, which is basically a fancy academic word for the spirit guy.
Fee is fantastic. He writes from a Pentecostal tradition, but he is a rigorously demanding scholar. His lens is firmly focused on the spirit, the pneuma, and eschatology. Fee argues that the Corinthians' problem was actually theological at its core. They profoundly misunderstood what it meant to be spiritual. They thought spirituality was all about ecstatic speech and worldly wisdom, whereas Paul argues that true spirituality is entirely shaped by the cross.
And finally, we have Anthony C. Thiselton, the philosopher-linguist.
Thiselton is heavy lifting, but he's essential. He focuses heavily on speech act theory.
Okay, we definitely need to unpack that term before we go any further. Speech act theory.
Yeah, it's the idea that language doesn't just describe reality, it performs actions. It creates realities.
Like when a minister says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife."
Exactly. He isn't describing a pre-existing marriage. His words are actually creating the marriage in that moment. That's a performative speech act. So Thiselton looks at how Paul's language functions to shift reality, to create new commitments in the listeners. He also traces the history of interpretation from the ancient church fathers like Ciampa all the way down to modern times.
Okay, so we have the sociologist, the spirit theologian, and the philosopher. Let's see what they actually have to say about the text itself. We start right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 1. The salutation, Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes.
It seems like a standard opening, right? But our experts see fireworks right here in verse 1.
Thiselton jumps straight onto that word call. He links it back to the prophet Jeremiah.
Yes, Thiselton highlights the compulsion of the call. It's not just a nice job title Paul picked up, it's a divine necessity. Paul isn't doing this because he saw a vacancy and applied for it. And Fee backs this up heavily by emphasizing the divine origin. The text says, by the will of God. Fee points out that Paul's authority doesn't come from the church at all. The Corinthians didn't vote him in, so they absolutely cannot vote him out.
Garland adds a really great nuance here regarding the social dynamic of that. He says, because Paul is called by God, he's beholden to no congregation. The call captured and constrained him. In a Roman patronage culture, usually the speaker is completely beholden to the person paying them, the patron. But Paul steps in and says, no, I have different patron entirely.
Right, and then look at who he is writing to in verse 2, to the church of God that is in Corinth. Garland points out that the Greek word for church here, ecclesia, wasn't originally a religious word. It was a strictly political word.
Remember the assembly.
Yes, the assembly of recognized citizens who gathered to make official decisions for the city. So by calling them the ecclesia of God, Paul is doing something deeply subversive. He is completely redefining their assembly. They aren't just a voluntary club or a burial society, which were super common back then. They're God's assembly. They are a miniature kingdom of God operating right inside the Roman colony.
And then he calls them saints, called to be saints. Now, when I hear saint, my modern brain thinks of a statue or someone who has, performed 3 verified miracles.
Right, but Fee is very clear here. Called to be saints isn't a future goal you achieve after a lifetime of exceptionally good behavior. It's a status you have already received. You are a saint because God set you apart for his purposes. It's about your position, not your moral perfection, which is deeply ironic given just how imperfect the Corinthians are about to turn out to be in the rest of this letter.
And Thiselton points out a speech act right here in verse 2 as well.
Yeah.
Paul writes to all those who call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thiselton says this is a commissive speech act.
Right. To call on the name isn't just a quiet private prayer, it's a public pledge of allegiance. It's a commissive act, meaning you are publicly committing yourself to a Lord. And in a Roman colony where Caesar is Lord, to publicly say Jesus is Lord is a massive political tear in the fabric of their Roman identity. It's almost treasonous in a sense.
Paul follows this up with grace and peace. Fee calls this a Christianizing of the standard greeting of the day.
It's a beautiful synthesis. The standard Greek greeting on the street was charein, which means greetings. Paul tweaks it slightly to charis, which means grace. And then he adds the traditional Hebrew greeting, shalom, peace. Thiselton notes this is a double whammy. It's a greeting, but it's also a prayer. He is literally praying grace and peace onto them in the very act of them reading the letter.
So we move from the greeting to the Thanksgiving section in verses 4 through 9. And honestly, this is the part that always confuses me when I read it. Paul's about to spend 15 chapters ripping these people apart for being divisive, arrogant, and grossly immoral. But he starts by thanking God for them. I mean, is he being sarcastic?
That is the exact tension of this section. But Fee insists very strongly it is not irony. It's not sarcasm. Paul genuinely thanks God for the gifts they have. Fee puts it beautifully. He calls it good things gone sour.
Good things gone sour. I really like that framing.
The gifts specifically, he mentions speech and knowledge, they are real. The Corinthians really were articulate. They really did have deep spiritual insights. The problem wasn't the gifts themselves, it was their toxic attitude toward them. They were taking God's gifts and using them to puff themselves up and establish a pecking order.
Garland notices something really interesting here too. Paul thanks God specifically for their speech, the logos, and their knowledge, the gnosis. Garland points out these are the exact areas where they are insanely arrogant.
It's a brilliant rhetorical move by Paul. He validates the very things they are most proud of, but he frames them entirely as gifts from God. You can't boast about a gift you received. If I give you a Ferrari, you can't brag to everyone about being a master car manufacturer. You just got lucky that I handed you the keys. Paul is strategically grounding their pride before he actively attacks it.
And Fee points out a crucial little phrase tucked into verse 7, as you eagerly wait for our Lord Jesus Christ to be revealed.
Ah, yes. The not yet. This is Fee's eschatological lens coming through perfectly. Remember, the Corinthians thought they had already arrived. They thought the show was basically over and they were already taking their bows on stage. Paul subtly reminds them, hey, you are still waiting? You haven't crossed the finish line yet. It redirects their focus away from their present social status and points it toward the future judgment.
So he's buttered them up a bit, he reminded them of the true source of their gifts, and he pointed them to the future. Now the gloves come completely off. Verse 10. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree and that there be no divisions among you.
The report of factions. This is the inciting incident of the entire letter. Chloe's people, who were likely servants or maybe family members of a wealthy woman named Chloe, have traveled to Paul and reported quarrels.
And the Greek word Paul uses for divisions here is schismata.
Yes. Thiselton dives really deep into this specific word. Schismata literally means a tear. It's used physically for a tear in a garment or a rip in a fishing net. But it was also used commonly in Greek politics for a severe rift in political consciousness. It's not just that they are bickering over minor issues, they're fundamentally tearing the body politic apart.
Now let's talk about the exact nature of these divisions, because this is where our commentators really start to duke it out. We have these famous slogans in verse 12. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. What is actually happening on the ground here?
This is the commentary showdown moment for sure. Garland argues firmly against the idea that these were fixed theological parties. He doesn't think there was a specific Pauline doctrine versus a separate Apollos doctrine being debated.
So what does Garland think is driving this?
He thinks it's purely sociological. It's all about patronage and client relationships. In Corinth, as we established, you defined yourself by who your big man was. Garland suggests these slogans might actually be caricatures invented by Paul. He thinks Paul is impersonating them to show the utter silliness of their personality cults. He calls it absurdist comedy.
Like he's actively mocking them. Oh, look at me, I'm with Apollos, I'm so smart.
Exactly. Garland believes the root issue is the spirit of competition, not the actual content of the teaching. But Fee disagrees slightly here.
Where does Fee land on the factions?
Fee thinks the theology actually matters. He suggests the division in Corinth is likely over and against Paul specifically. He believes they viewed Apollos as a true wisdom teacher, someone possessing Sophia. Because Apollos was from Alexandria, he was highly eloquent, he probably used a lot of sophisticated allegory. And the Corinthians loved that stuff. They probably thought, finally, a really smart teacher. Paul's plain preaching was so boring. So Fee thinks there is a real substantive rejection of Paul's presentation of the gospel happening here.
And what about Thiselton?
Thiselton agrees largely with the power struggle thesis. It's about inflation and status. He actually cites Clement of Rome, who wrote a letter to Corinth decades later to show that this exact jealousy and rivalry was a chronic, systemic problem in that specific city. It's the ugly politics of the tear, the schismata.
And then there's that fourth group, the I follow Christ group. That always sounds like the classic Sunday school answer, doesn't it? Well, you guys are arguing, but I follow Jesus.
Right, but in this specific context, it's probably the most arrogant group of all. It implies you guys follow mayor men, but we have a direct line to the boss. It's spiritual one-upmanship. It's claiming a special, unmediated access to Christ that completely bypasses the authority of the apostles entirely.
Paul then drops this incredibly heavy line in verse 17. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now, some modern readers look at that and think Paul is actively minimizing baptism.
Fee corrects that misconception immediately. Paul is absolutely not minimizing baptism as a sacrament. He is separating it from the Roman patronage system. In the ancient world, if you were baptized by a famous philosophical guru, you essentially became part of his inner circle. You gained instant social status by association. Paul is saying, no, the baptizer is nothing. The gospel is everything. He utterly refuses to let a holy sacrament become just another tool for social climbing.
And specifically, he says he was sent to preach, quote, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power.
Here's where it gets really profound. This is the massive pivot point of the chapter. We are moving from the messy social problem, the factions, down to the theological root, which is wisdom versus the cross.
Garland notes that the cross was, as a concept, completely repugnant to Roman sensibilities. He quotes Cicero, and I love this quote. Cicero said, the very word cross should be far removed from the thoughts, the eyes, and the ears of a Roman citizen.
It was obscene. We really have to work hard to recover the sheer horror of it today. We wear it as gold jewelry. We put it on our living room walls. But for them, it was the electric chair, but vastly worse because it involved days of agonizing public torture and complete nakedness. It was specifically designed to strip you of all human honor. It was the ultimate slave's death.
So when Paul starts talking about the word of the cross in verse 18, he is bringing up a subject that polite Roman society literally did not talk about at dinner parties.
And he contrasts it directly with wisdom, Sophia. Now, our commentators have a bit of a showdown here as well on what exactly wisdom means in this context.
Let's get into that. What is the wisdom that Paul is so aggressively attacking?
Fee sees it primarily as philosophy and reason, the Greek idolatry of the human mind. It's the arrogant demand that God must make perfect logical sense to us. The idea that salvation comes through intellectually understanding the deep, hidden structures of the universe.
But Garland sees it through a different lens.
Garland sees it as rhetorical skill and social status. The Roman idolatry. It's not just about what you know, but how persuasively you say it. It's about being impressive, being rhetorically polished, and always winning the public debate. It's a fundamental attitude of hubris.
And Paul says this worldly wisdom is completely destroyed by the cross. Verse 22. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom.
Fee breaks this dynamic down perfectly. The Jews wanted signs, meaning they wanted triumphal power. They wanted a massive Exodus-style miracle, a conquering Messiah who crushes Rome with plagues and pillars of fire. They wanted a roaring lion.
And the Greeks.
They wanted wisdom. They wanted a tight, coherent philosophical system that explained the entire universe through pure reason. They wanted an intellectual explanation.
And God gives them a crucified carpenter from a backwater town.
Precisely. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block. The Greek word is scandalon. Fee notes that Deuteronomy 21.23 explicitly says anyone hanged on a tree is cursed by God. So a crucified Messiah is, by definition, a cursed Messiah. It's a massive theological contradiction. It's fried ice.
And to the Greeks.
It's foolishness. Moria. That's literally where we get the English word moron. It's madness. Why on earth would an all-powerful God allow himself to be publicly humiliated? It doesn't make any logical sense to them. It's weak. It's stupid.
But then Paul flips the entire script in verse 25. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength.
This is the great reversal. Garland points out that the cross completely overturns the ancient pyramid of gods. In the ancient world, gods were at the top of the pyramid simply because they had the most lethal power. Victory was always won by killing your enemies. But here, in the gospel, victory is won by dying.
It's a complete and total inversion of their core values.
It is. And if you miss this, you miss the whole point of Christianity entirely. God saves the world not by overwhelming it with raw power or outsmarting it with brilliant philosophy, but by willingly entering into its deepest suffering and shame.
So Paul has attacked their core message, the wisdom versus the cross. Now, in the final section of the chapter, verses 26 through 31, he basically attacks them. Or rather, he attacks their inflated egos.
It's the classic look around the room argument. Verse 26. Consider your calling, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth.
Ouch. I mean, tell us how you really feel, Paul.
It is a bit of a backhanded compliment, isn't it? Garland calls this empirical evidence. Paul is basically saying, look around the room at yourselves. If God loved high status and worldly wisdom so much, why did he pick you guys?
Garland notes that while there were definitely some high-status people in the Corinthian church, people like Erastus, the city treasurer, or Gaius, the vast majority of the congregation were basically nobodies.
And Paul uses a very specific, deeply philosophical phrase here. He says, God chose the things that are not temiante to nullify the things that are.
The things that are not. That sounds incredibly existential.
No, it is deeply profound. In Greek philosophy, being was absolutely everything. If you had social status, wealth, a good family name, you existed. You had ontos. If you were a slave, if you were poor or uneducated, you were considered a non-entity. Socially speaking, you didn't exist. You were a literal zero.
So God intentionally builds his eternal kingdom out of non-entities.
Yes. Garland says God chose the nothings to completely turn the somethings into nothing. It's a total radical leveling of the human playing field. God bypasses the cultural VIP room entirely and goes straight out into the streets.
And Fee says the ultimate goal of all this subversive action is found right in verse 29. So that no one may boast before him.
That's the absolute clincher. Think about it. If salvation depended on human wisdom, the intellectually gifted people would boast. If it depended on power, the strong and the wealthy would boast. But since it depends entirely on a crucified criminal and is freely given to social nobodies, the only thing left to boast in is God himself.
Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord.
Exactly. The ground is perfectly level at the foot of the cross.
So let's pause here and do our commentary showdown to pull this all together. We have these three distinct perspectives: Garland, Fee, and Thiselton. Where do they really clash, and where do they complement each other in this chapter?
Well, the biggest clash is definitely on the nature of the parties we talked about. Garland is very firm that they are not theological factions. He views the I follow Paul or Apollos slogans as deliberate caricatures by Paul. He focuses heavily on the sociological drive for status. He basically thinks they're just acting like good Romans.
And Fee takes the other side.
Fee disagrees. He suggests the opposition to Paul is real and it's personal. He believes they genuinely viewed Apollos as a superior wisdom teacher compared to Paul's plain, unpolished speech. Fee focuses on the spiritual misunderstanding of the gospel. He thinks they actually have bad theology, not just bad cultural manners.
And where does Thiselton sit between them?
Thiselton leans hard into the political metaphor. He sees schismata as a literal tear in the body politic. He tends to agree with the power struggle thesis over the theological controversy thesis, but he adds that incredible linguistic depth regarding how their speech acts are creating the divide.
What about their views on the meaning of wisdom?
Fee sees it as philosophy and reason Greek idolatry. Garland sees it as rhetorical skill and social status Roman idolatry.
Honestly, reading the text, I think they are probably both right. Corinth was a Roman colony situated in Greece. It's highly likely a toxic mix of both.
I completely agree. It's that New York in the 80s vibe again. It's about being both intellectually smart and socially powerful. They wanted it all.
And how would you describe the differing tones of our three guides?
Garland reads very much like a historian or sociologist patiently explaining the culture. He helps you see the reality at street level. Fee reads like a passionate pastor and theologian who is deeply moved by the cross and the Spirit. He helps you really feel the heavy weight of their theological error. And Thiselton reads like a meticulous scholar analyzing the deep language structure. He helps you understand the hidden mechanics of the text itself.
That's a great summary. So let's synthesize all of this into a big idea.
Yeah.
What is the single controlling theological concept the listener needs to take away from 1 Corinthians chapter 1?
I'd say it's this. The gospel of the cross is an absolute fundamental contradiction to human systems of power, status, and wisdom.
Let's cement that. Say that one more time.
The gospel of the cross is an absolute contradiction to human systems of power, status, and wisdom. God destroys human boasting by saving the world through a crucified criminal and building his church out of social nobodies.
It definitively proves that his foolishness is vastly stronger than our greatest wisdom.
Correct. It shatters our paradigms.
So let's cross the application bridge. Let's bring this into the 21st century. What does this actually mean for us today? Because we aren't living in a Roman colony.
Right.
We don't have people walking around in togas suing each other in the agora, but we definitely have celebrity culture.
Oh, absolutely. The modern parallel is almost undeniable. You can easily connect the teacher cults of ancient Corinth to modern celebrity pastor culture in the church today. We naturally align ourselves with theological brands. We say things like, oh, I listen to Tim Keller because he's so intellectual, or I follow Francis Chan because he's so radical, or I listen to Joel Osteen because he's relentlessly encouraging.
It's literally, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, just with modern names.
It's exactly the same underlying dynamic. Garland's point about personality-centered politics applies perfectly to church splits happening today, which are so often about human ego and branding, not actual doctrine. It's about whose brand is winning the culture war.
And what about the wisdom trap? How does that manifest today?
This is the constant danger of intellectual elitism in the modern church. We often try so hard to make the gospel sound impressive or philosophically acceptable to the secular world. We want our faith to be invited to the TED Talk. We want the New York Times to write a glowing review of our theology.
But Paul says the cross is a scandal. It's fried ice.
Exactly. You cannot polish the scandal. Fee's insight about taming God is incredibly huge here. We constantly want a God of signs meaning power and visible success, or a God of wisdom meaning neat explanations and airtight apologetics. But what we actually get is a crucified Lord. If we try to make the gospel cool or smart by removing the raw offense of the cross, we completely empty it of its saving power.
That is a really hard pill to swallow for the modern church. We desperately want to be respected by the culture around us.
But the gospel explicitly calls us to identify with the things that are not, the tamianta, to identify with the humiliated, rejected Christ.
So here is a provocative question for you to mull over as we close. If Paul walked into your local church this Sunday, would he recognize it as a community shaped entirely by the cross? Or would he just see a mirror of the status-obsessed, excellence-driven culture around it? Have we just replaced Corinthian rhetorical polish with modern production values and slick marketing?
Are we ultimately boasting in our cultural relevance and our wisdom, or are we truly boasting only in the Lord?
That's the heavy question we leave you with today. Next time, we dive into chapter 2,
where Paul explains exactly why he flat out refused to use wise and persuasive words when he came to them, and what the secret wisdom of God actually entails.
Spoiler alert for next time. It heavily involves the Spirit. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
See you then.